We're live now. Welcome to Canada Bangladesh Social Justice Action Research Alliance. We organize critical and courageous conversations connected to equity, fairness, and social justice about local and global issues. We organize these conversations to facilitate critical thinking for marginalized students in Bangladesh and marginalized communities across the world, and for anybody who is committed to learn to think critically. The reason we use these conversations, the reason we organize these conversations, so that our students, our young people, they learn to think critically and independently. I often say this is that we live in an increasingly hyper-connected world. And if you do not learn to think critically, it is almost impossible to be compassionate, considerate, kind towards each other. My today's guest is Professor David Livingstone Smith. I was just saying Professor Smith moments ago that he is a rock star to me. I mean, I'm a huge, huge fan of Professor Smith's work. His work has helped me immensely to understand a lot of mindless cruelty that I have grown up seeing around me, and a lot of mindless cruelty that I see today's world. Professor Smith, does not need any introduction, but I'll just try to do a little bit of that. Professor David Livingstone Smith is one of the leading authorities studying what makes humans cruel. In Times Literary Supplement, Professor Smith has been described as a philosopher seeking not just to interpret the world, but to change it. It's a very profound statement. And when I read Professor Smith's work, I could see the reason behind it. Professor Smith borrows from a range of disciplines like philosophy, evolutionary biology, history, anthropology, and psychology to give the readers an intimate understanding that what makes us our worst enemy. Professor Smith is one of the most remarkable philosophers of our time. His book on Inhumanity has been praised by one of my, role models. I look up to him immensely, Cornel West, a living legend and a prominent African-American philosopher. Cornel West as a philosophically sophisticated and prophetically courageous treatment of dehumanization, especially in regard to race. And as I was mentioning, all the Professor Smith writes about, and as I'm borrowing his word, is that he does not write about beautiful, rosy stuff, things that are raw reality. And I find it immensely liberating. I know that I'm out of excitement, probably stammering. Uh, uh, Thank you so much, Dr. David Livingstone Smith, for coming to our discussion.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. It's truly an honor.
Thank you so much. One of the things that I would like to remind you in the beginning of our conversation is that a lot of the audience are from Bangladesh, and we'll be using this conversation subsequently to facilitate critical literacy for Bangladeshi students. So I know that when you write a lot of the contents in your book, they're in American context. Bangladesh being a British colony for over nearly 200 years, we have a very colonized perception. We are subject of psychic colonization. So when you give your examples, just please be mindful of the fact that they might not know what is Jim Crow,
of course,
or what happened to Henry Smith, why it happened to Henry Smith.
Yeah.
So that sort of thing.
Okay.
So my first question to you, Dr. David, is that in your book on Inhumanity, in the first chapter, you write about that what motivated you to write about what you write. Could you tell us about your motivation to go into one of the dark or into such things?
Well, I could answer that in several ways, but I think I'll address what you just referred to. So I grew up in the southern United States, and you can look at me, I'm not a young man. So I grew up in the 1950s and 60s in the deep, deep, deep South. Now, the southern United States is, of course, well known for its racism. And this was in the days of what we in the States call the Jim Crow era, where there was basically very, very brutal, savage, and explicit racism directed primarily against African Americans, against Black people. So I grew up in that environment. Now, I also grew up in a sort of an environment that resonated with that. I grew up in an extended family with my mother's parents. Now, my mother was Jewish, and her parents were Jewish refugees from Eastern Europe. They left long before the Holocaust, so they were not part of that generation. But they fled, fleeing or their families fled. They were very small children, fleeing the pogroms. When the Christians would come in and decide to rape and kill Jewish communities. My grandmother, in particular, influenced me very deeply. She had to leave school at a very young age, at 14 or so, because her father had abandoned the family of her and her brothers. And actually, that cut short what was a very promising career. She was a very talented singer and pianist. But even though she had to leave school at that young age, she was a brilliant, self-educated woman. And she was deeply interested in really the history of oppression, Native Americans, of the British Empire, of the oppression of Black people in the United States, and of course, the oppression of Jewish people. So she taught me a lot about those things, and it helped me to make sense of the world that I was living in, this brutal, racist world of the Deep South. And I sort of carried that sensibility forward. It was always in the background. So later on in life, when I became an academic and started doing my research and so on, I found myself interested in the terrible things that human beings do to one another, interested in understanding it. And of course, the point of understanding it is to do something about it. If you want to intervene in the world, you need to understand the world. And that led me eventually to my main topic, which is dehumanization, which not too many people study, strangely enough. So that's the story. So maybe 15 years ago, my autobiographical concerns sort of converged with my research concerns, and that's where I am now.
Yeah, I mean, when I was reading the first chapter, I mean, that left to, I mean, obviously in social science research, we write about our positionality. So you write extensively about dehumanization. And so, and one of the things that I love about your writing is that, philosophy is notoriously inaccessible. I wish that we were compassionate when we're writing. I say this because when I first came to Canada as an international graduate student, I was a steward for international graduate students. And a lot of the times, I'm not saying that the complex language is not necessary, but at times it's oppressive. Uh, so your work, I say to my friends that I have a set of survival books. When I'm sad, when I'm heartbroken, I go to a set of books to understand human conditions. In the words of Nietzsche, human and all too human. Uh, could you explain to us, without using academic jargon, for average, all of everybody, so that everybody can understand, that what is dehumanization?
Sure. But first, let me say that, yes, indeed, a lot of philosophy is unnecessarily obscure and esoteric. And I think that's a waste of time, to be honest. I don't want to write things that 12 people will read. I want to write for humanity. And there are two aspects of that. Well, actually, let me say this. I have a friend, a brilliant African-American philosopher, who talks about what he calls street philosophy. I try to do street philosophy. And what that means is I try to write in ways that are accessible to anyone,
I love
anyone
it.
who wants to pick up the book. I try to address things that actually matter, that make a difference to human life and just life on the planet generally. And I think it's very important as well. I take a stance against oppressive ways of thinking and oppressive ways of acting. All right, so there's all that together. Now, dehumanization. Well, this is a word that entered the English language early 19th century, and it's picked up a lot of different meanings. So people mean all kinds of things by it. And that's sort of unfortunate because if we're trying to understand something, it's really helpful to be clear about what it is.
Mm-hmm.
So what I mean, there isn't a right and a wrong definition, right?
Mm-hmm.
So all anyone can say is what they mean by the word. What I mean is the attitude of thinking of other members of our species as subhuman creatures, all right? And by subhuman, I mean lower on the hierarchy of creation. I mean, their lives don't matter or they don't matter much. And they're conceived of as either dangerous predators or filthy creatures, vermin, or in the most toxic forms of dehumanization as monsters or demonic beings.
Going back to the work of philosophy, I have this question on the list anyway.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the things, I mean, my graduate research was in the areas of coloniality of knowledge production, that
Yeah.
how Bangladesh being a former British colony, how the knowledge that we consume, that we produce in so many ways are a product of psychic colonization. When
Mm-hmm.
I came to know subsequently in my life, towering figures like Martin Heidegger, what was his moral position? Um, what was the moral position of John Stuart Mill?
Mm-hmm.
Um, when I came to know that, and you write about it, in your work as well, that the idea of scientific racism is that scientists who are supposed to be objective, when and I say it this way, is that pretty much anybody who comes from a very humble background. I was born and raised in a village. I have 11 siblings. I'm the first in my family to attend university ever. My parents live in the same village where they were born.
Mm-hmm.
So my journey of socioeconomic journey has been very humbling. Um, Questioning the knowledge, the source, who is saying, isn't something that we learn.
That's right.
Um, how do you, as a scholar, as a teacher, and I love the phrase street philosophy, um, if you will, a street philosopher, how do you teach your students that learn to question, no, what was the position of Martin Heidegger? What was the position of John Stuart Mill? And I was very attracted to Marx, but later in my life, when I read about Marx's racist attitude, I mean, when I came to university, Marx was a hero to me. I
Mm.
looked up to him. Those revolutionary line that workers of the world, you have nothing to lose but your
Yeah,
chains.
beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah, that touches you
Yeah.
so deeply.
Mm-hmm.
But later, when I found his deeply racist positions about Indians,
Mm.
it broke my heart.
Mm.
How do you see it, and how do you help your students to learn about them?
Well, I mean, practically speaking, um, I'm not interested in my students having, philosophical idols, right? I'm just not interested. I think it's a waste of time. I teach undergraduates. I don't have graduate students. And they're just passing through philosophy, right? They're not majoring in anything. What I'm trying to do with them is to cultivate certain habits of mind, questioning, being critical, having intellectual courage, and so on. And this isn't for most of my courses, right? So that's my goal. I'm not even interested, frankly, in them retaining information. I want them to develop attitudes and abilities. Um, uh, in my course, there's one course I teach. In fact, I'm teaching it this semester on race and racism. That's a little bit different. And you just tell the truth. It's, it's not difficult unless you're worshiping these figures. I mean, as a thinker, you take the good and leave the bad, but don't deny the bad, which is what's been done. So if you're looking for people in the Western intellectual tradition, and actually lots of other intellectual traditions as well, who are not racists or homophobes or misogynists, you're going to have a long search, right? I mean, Immanuel Kant was the father of scientific racism. David Hume made racist remarks. Anyone you can think of, right? That ideology is so baked in to our civilizations that, people breathe it in the air that they breathe, right? And we should make alert to that, and we should not segregate it from these people's intellectual contributions. We don't want to reduce their contributions to, they're just, apologists for empire. We don't want to do that, but we do want to notice that there is a relationship on what's spoken about, what isn't spoken about, the way things are spoken about. So that's my view. And I think to some extent we're all prisoners of this because the ideologies are so pervasive, so deep, right? So our only hope of fighting our way out is to learn to think about them and to to identify them and to push back. And that's what I really want to get my students to do. Bottom line, have the courage to push back, to see through the bullshit.
I mean, when you said it so beautifully that the ideologies are so stubborn and so deeply seated,
Yeah.
it reminded me of Carl Jung, that people don't have ideas, ideas have people.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's both, all right? So Jung's is just as one-sided as the more conventional view.
Yeah.
Yeah. Our ideas don't arise just from within in some kind of magical way. We're born into cultures, and we're born into cultures with long, long, long histories.
Mm-hmm.
And in those long histories, certain beliefs and values get sedimented, locked in, so much that they seem just so obviously true that they're unquestionable. And it's a very difficult thing, but a very, very important thing, increasingly so, to be able to question the seemingly unquestionable.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that perplexed me from your book on Inhumanity is, and I have never, I have had one experience where one of my very, very favorite professors, very prominent Black scholars from Canada, in different meetings, I have seen that students or people, mostly, white professors or white students, they would be in awe, saying that, oh my God, look at him. His arguments are so sharp. And then I read your book, and that blew my mind when you were saying that it's possible to racialize somebody because of their certain intellectual proclivity, or like, for example, the Asians, the Chinese are good in mathematics, or
Yeah.
the Jewish are, money makers, and etc.
Yeah.
Could you please speak to that? That,
Yeah.
praising can also be deceptive.
Yeah. So let me back up a little bit and move into it in that way. I really do think the idea of race is maybe the most evil idea in history. I mean, race has no scientific basis. And ideas about race have basically emerged to justify the oppression of one group of people by another. It's got nothing going for it. Unfortunately, many people try to, in fact, this is the general view, combat racism by affirming race. But that's like trying to put out a fire by pouring gasoline on it. I think that racism is built into the idea of race. It's part of it. because that's how the idea of race originated culturally. And that's one of these ideologies which is so baked in, you can't just, you know, snap your fingers and clean it up, right? So I really think, and so many people disagree with it, race, the very idea of race needs to be battled against. You see, you know, when you talk about colonialism, it's racialized colonialism that you're talking about, right? I mean, over here in the United States, we were a colony too, but a totally different thing going on, right? Because it wasn't racialized. Now, to make sense of that, to make sense of how race works, the first thing is to sort of tease out its elements. And unfortunately, and this is particularly true of Americans, because Americans always think they're the center of the world, right? They just do.
American exceptionalism.
Yeah, exceptionalism, right? Exceptionally grandiose sometimes. That people tend to be too local. See, what we need if we're trying to understand race is a very broad conception that will include the racialization of Bangladeshis, I'm sorry, say by the Buddhist majority in Myanmar, African American people here, Jews in Nazi Germany. So a very diverse bunch of people. And here's how I think it works. The idea of race is the idea that there are a few kinds of human beings, 5 or 6 kinds of human beings, sharply divided, and that everyone on Earth is either a pure specimen of one of these kinds or a mixture. That's the first element. The second element, membership in these categories, these kinds, is transmitted by descent. Typically, it works by if your parents are a member of a certain race, you are a member of that race. There are some cultures where it's believed that you can absorb race through milk that you drink when you're a baby, by the way. It's a common folk idea. And third, these races are arranged on a hierarchy. So they're inferior and superior races. Now, if you understand race in that way, first of all, it's very broad. It includes the racialization of so many different people by other people, even if the word race isn't used. And all right, so then you might ask, well, why does this happen? Races are manufactured out of oppression, right? So when one group of people when they feel it's advantageous to them to dominate another group of people, one of these steps is to conceive of them as a separate race, a separate and inferior race, right? Then that legitimates all sorts of awful things, right? And in the extreme, genocide. Now, if you think about that, it implies that any difference can get racialized, right? It could be a political difference, could be a religious difference. It could be a linguistic difference. As long as the element of domination, the motivation for domination is present, you can get the manufacture of races. And with dehumanization, I mean, racialization is really the first step to dehumanization. Groups that are dehumanized, that are thought of as subhuman, are typically first racialized.
One of the ideas that I found incredibly helpful and something that I can teach to my Bangladeshi students and get into a dialogue with them is that you build a wonderful description that race is more nuanced and complex than the color of your skin.
Yeah.
Like you talk about that, the persecution of the Nazis of the Jews by the Nazis, they are the same. They both that same color. So, could you speak to that race is not essentially whether you are black or brown or white?
So it's all historically contingent. So the way race works, say in South Asia, is different than the way that race works in Great Britain, just different than the way race works in Rwanda or Sudan or Japan. So there are these common factors, those three things that I listed. But it depends on the history and the sort of the forces on the ground in a culture, what gets selected. And the Nazi Germany is a really good example. So look, I'm Jewish. When I had hair, it was blonde. I'm 6 feet 4 inches tall. I have blue eyes. And yet in Nazi Germany, I would be regarded as a mixed race person because my mother was Jewish and my father was Christian. Um, it's no accident that the Nazis had to put yellow stars on Jewish people because they couldn't tell them apart for the most part. If they didn't dress in traditional Jewish garb, as most German Jews didn't, it was Jews to the east who, had the long beards and the unusual hats and so on. So here's the idea in race. And this is really how I think racial thinking works. What makes someone a member of a certain race is supposed to be something on the inside, something that's not observable. There may be outward signs of that, like skin color, eye shape, whatever. Depends on the historical period and the place, how this is working. But those are just outward signs. And racial thinking is perfectly okay with the idea that one may look like a member of the dominant race, but really be on the inside a member of the subordinate race. And in the United States, that's called passing. A Black person who has maybe an appearance like me, right? So obviously then it's not the appearance that makes them Black, it's their descent. It's the family history. And the way the thinking goes, they're really Black, even though they look white. And every racist regime has this, because there are always people who slip through the cracks, you see. And this is regarded as threatening to the dominant class.
I mobilize an identity with a lot of my friends is that the relationship between identity and intellect. I happen to have experienced it is that the intellect is incapable of believing anything. Intellect only wants to understand what it doesn't understand. But then identity has a crazy capacity of enslaving our intellect and using it for its purpose. So, in a lot of the conversation to my friends, I say that I wouldn't say that, well, as a blue, as a white, or as a green, or as a yellow.
Mm-hmm.
I say that I literally use this term is that as a nothing means I do not have allegiance to any ideology,
Mm-hmm.
but a commitment, a courage. I have fear. I have fear of retribution. I have fear
Yeah.
of violence.
Mm-hmm.
As I was just mentioning to you moments ago, is that before my immigration process was done in Canada, I used to have this anxiety in me all the time. And one of the moments that has been seared in my memory that I'll never forget is that in Canada, we have this very peculiar rule that when your immigration is done, you have to cross the border and you have to re-enter.
All right. Yes.
Yeah. So I crossed the American border. I mean, and then we're re-entering. And there, I have seen that tired mothers with their babies on their lap. If you look at them in the eyes, you can see
Mm-hmm.
that tiredness.
Mm-hmm.
And I came to the office and my friend was asking, "Hey, how was the border?" And this was my realization, and I don't think I'll ever forget that. I was telling you what the border today taught me is that border doesn't bleed, bodies do. Borders
Yeah.
don't feel hungry, but bodies do.
Yeah.
So I was thinking that we as humans have this urge to identify with a group and to believe in something. And you write in your book, you immobilize a concept is called the psychology of the uncanny, whether Freud or
Mm-hmm.
Yench or what the Japanese roboticist Mori, he talks about the psychology of the uncanny.
Mm-hmm.
um, Could you speak to that? I forgot the German philosopher's name who's talked about the Jewish, that from the outside they appear as human,
Yeah.
and there's a German expression Ultraman or something.
Untermensch,
Untermensch,
subhuman.
Untermensch.
Yeah, yeah.
Could you speak to that? How, because it's happening in Bangladesh right now, is that the Rohingya refugees who are in here,
Mm.
we have started using a lot of the terms that dehumanizes them.
Oh, gosh.
They're dehumanized in Myanmar.
Yeah,
They have started being dehumanized by us.
that's those people. Geez, that they've been through such.
Could you speak to that process of that Untermensch,
Hmm.
the psychology of the uncanny?
Yeah, yeah, sure, sure. And I think this is really, really important. Um, so I think the way to start is to start with how dehumanization gets going in the first place. Right. So when one group of people or members of that group think of members of another group as less than human, it's not something that just happens, right? It's ideological. It's typically has a deep historical root, but also is prompted, ignited. I like the word ignited by people in positions of power and influence. Those might be politicians, they might be religious leaders, they might even be celebrities, right? The important thing is that they are seen as credible. So these people say, these Rohingya, they're reincarnations of vermin, as was said in Myanmar, or these Jews are subhumans, or these black men are predatory apes, or whatever. And sometimes this has the stamp of science. Sometimes it has the stamp of other sorts of social authority. Now, the point is, and this is simplifying quite a bit, when the experts say things, we accept them, and very often we should, right? What the physicists tell us, what the virologists tell us, say about COVID, we accept if we're smart, and we should, because they're experts. But the experts can also lead us astray, like the Nazi race experts, like the scientific racists that you were referring to earlier. So we tend to, if we're told in the right way, under the right circumstances, that some group of people is less than human, there's an inclination to take it on board, particularly if they scare. Say these people, they're breeding quickly, they're going to overrun the country, they're going to rape the women, the usual things we see again and again and again, right? But at the very same time, and this is so important, it's a feature, I think, of being a human being that we automatically recognize humanness in others. So, and I think this is really outside of our control. So when you look into a pair of human eyes, when you look at a human face, like you and I are looking at each other right now, we just can't help seeing human. We can't turn it off. It's automatic. Now, what that means is that when people take on these views of others as subhuman, coexisting side by side with it is a view of seeing them as human. Now, let's think about what that means. It means if I'm dehumanizing you, I see you sort of in one part of my mind as all human, and in another part of my mind as all subhuman, like a monkey, say, which is a dehumanizing trope that has been used against South Asians, right? Now, this has an extremely toxic and dangerous effect. It turns you into a monster. If you look at the idea of a monster, the monsters that you find in horror fiction, say, they are impossible combinations, usually of human and non-human. Or let's put it a little bit differently. They're contradictory beings. So consider a zombie. and this is a line of thinking I take from philosopher Noel Carroll. Zombies are alive and dead at the same time. Makes no sense, right? But when that happens, a creature with these impossible characteristics is experienced as extremely disturbing, powerful and disturbing. So imagine a hand, just a disembodied hand crawling across the floor like a spider. Again, it's a contradictory being. It's a hand and it's a spider. It's very, very disturbing. The idea is very frightening, even though, I mean, let's face it, a hand can't do that much damage. It does not attach to a human being, right? You just kick it away. But there's something about it which is what I call metaphysically threatening. It upsets our basic conceptions of the order of things. So now to return, there's a German word for this state of mind. It's Unheimlichkeit. It's often translated as uncanniness. I prefer words like creepiness or horror. So when people are dehumanized, there are some different forms of dehumanization. I'm talking about the really dangerous, most dangerous form of dehumanization. In being seen as human and subhuman simultaneously, they're experienced as uncanny, as deeply disturbing, as extraordinarily powerful and dangerous. And this is so ironic and so tragic because it's typically the most marginalized people who are powerless, who are dehumanized in this way. And then they're seen as so dangerous, they must be, kicked out of the country or incarcerated or exterminated.
If I want to contextualize this from South Asian context, from Bangladesh,
Mm-hmm.
and so in 2011, a 15-year-old girl was trying to cross the border, Bangladesh-India border.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this girl comes from the northern part of Bangladesh, extremely marginalized, poverty, stricken
Mm-hmm.
community. When they're crossing the border, the border security force of India, when that girl's cloth got stuck in the barbed wire, she
Mm-hmm.
screamed in pain. And then a young soldier shot that girl in pain.
Mm-hmm.
And her body was hanging on the barbed wire for hours. And that's where I take your work, is that the spectacle lynching
Yeah.
of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and you and we forget, when you were just a moment ago, you were mentioning that the dehumanization process can be done even by the celebrities, and
Yeah.
it is done in many ways by the celebrities.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking about the film Birth of a Nation,
Yeah.
a movie that portrays black men as this danger, this deviant creature without a soul
Yeah.
that is raping a white woman.
Yeah.
And that movie was shown in the White House
Mm-hmm.
not very long ago.
That's right.
Unfortunately, what is happening, because of neoliberalization of academia, the branches of knowledge like social sciences, philosophy, social, history, sociology,
Mm-hmm.
are becoming extremely marginalized.
That's right.
In a world that is so hyper connected, in a world where the propaganda can be done with computational digital means, where it's so easy to mobilize hatred, so easy. Just few
Mm-hmm.
days ago, one of the very powerful ministers of India, Amit Shah, said, whether something is true or not, that's not important. We can make anything viral.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in a case like this, do you feel concerned that when the world is facing existential threat on multiple fronts, climate change, pandemic, political polarization, So, and you document well that how propaganda has been a means of dehumanizing by
Mhm.
people of power and privilege. How do you think about the current state of digital disinformation, current means of computational propaganda, when Oxford Internet Institute has published a report in 2019 that 84 countries, not general people, the states are buying computational resources, hiring cyber troopers to dehumanize through digital means.
Mm.
What are your thoughts on that, Professor Smith?
Oh, wow. Um, I guess to start, you said something very important. I want to reaffirm it that in the universities, the humanities are dying. Um, uh, and this is a tragedy for all sorts of reasons. Under-resourced, marginalized, and at least in the United States, uh, disrespected by the culture generally. Um, the humanities and to some extent the social sciences are the two places left in the university where there can be pushback against these things. That's the sites of critique. And so the marginalization, say, of philosophy, my discipline, when universities want to get rid of the department, it's often philosophy, even though we're not expensive to run. The marginalization of the humanities is a political act. We have lots and lots of students studying STEM courses, but not understanding the way that science, say, is ideologically embedded and so on. Not understanding a whole lot of things, and I think it's extraordinarily dangerous. When authoritarian regimes take hold, one of their first moves is usually to attack the intellectuals, to attack the universities. And this is a very subtle way of doing that. I mean, the universities do it themselves because the universities are businesses and they want students and they want culturally endorsed programs and so on. In any case, enough about that. My next book comes out in 2 months. And in that book, I have one chapter is a case study. It's a case study of anti-Semitic ideology from the 13th century to the present. And it follows a chapter on ideology. I have a particular theory of ideology. And so this is to illustrate this. And there are a couple of things that are very striking. First of all, the persistence of certain representations of Jews. It's just utterly remarkable. Over 700 years, these things remain intact. They still have power. And that's really depressing because it indicates that once ideological views like this take root, they're very difficult to get rid of. And I think perhaps the best we can do is simply make sure that they can't become active. But how do you do that? An economic downturn, global climate change. I mean, you just have a change in the ecology and these things just burst out. They've been there all along. That's what happened in Germany after World War I. Okay, now to get to my point. In order for ideologies, and in particular I'm concerned with dehumanizing and racist ideologies, to spread, they have to be reproduced. So there have to be apparatuses, they have to be mechanisms for the reproduction. Now, in the 14th century or the 13th century, most Europeans were illiterate. It's not like there were books they were reading or newspapers or pamphlets. They would have to go and listen to sermons or Christian passion plays in which Jews are evil murderers of Jesus, or look at the art, the anti-Semitic art that decorated public buildings. But that's very slow, it's very inefficient. A little bit later, printing press. comes in. But still, most people are illiterate. Now we get up to the 17th, 18th century, literacy becomes more widespread. The very same ideas could proliferate much more efficiently. They could spread much more widely, much more quickly. Now let's move up to the 20th century. Part of the genius of the Nazis was to realize that media, extremely important in proliferating ideologies. For them, it was the radio. They were the first to understand that radio was important. In fact, Joseph Goebbels, who was the propaganda minister, part of one of his projects was the manufacture of an inexpensive radio that ordinary Germans could afford, and they would be entertained, and the political ideology would come in, piggybacking on the entertainment. Right? Now we know that radio has played a part in other episodes of mass horror, like the Rwanda genocide. Now, radio was even more efficient and effective than books and pamphlets and so on, right? You don't have to be able to read to get the message from radio. And now we have the internet. And so the internet should be seen as part of this lineage of apparatuses of the reproduction of ideas. Now you see, anything, any mechanism that can reproduce good, beneficial, helpful, humane things can also be harnessed for distributing misinformation, disinformation, far-right ideology, fascist propaganda. These two things are two sides of the same coin. So the great promise of the internet is also its tremendous danger. Now, this becomes especially acute when social conditions make people receptive to fascist kinds of things. In my view, the chief driver of that is a sense of helplessness. The more helpless people feel, the more they're inclined to look for salvation. And of course, it's the authoritarian leader who comes along, like Modi, who I'm the guy. I can save you.
Yeah.
And if you're feeling really vulnerable, you're feeling really endangered, really helpless, then it's very tempting to swallow that message.
Yeah, Modi is the Trump of the South Asia, and he's doing extremely well.
Yeah.
And you know what really worries me? I recently, I'm sure that you're aware of Pegasus, the spyware that. India was a state that was sold to. You brought a very critical point that needs to be recognized, is the intellectuals. There was no time in the history of humanity where intellectuals that spoke to make us think were not persecuted. Mm-hmm. I mean, who drank hemlock?
Right.
What was his faults?
Yeah.
And what's painful, though, I mean, I'll bring two different essays side by side to work. One is the French philosopher, I forgot his name, is The Treason of the Intellectuals, and Noam Chomsky in 60s is that the responsibilities of the intellectuals. In a BBC interview, Chomsky was saying is that if you look at the history of humanity, pretty much in most cases, intellectuals who are intellectuals have worked for power.
That's right.
Bertrand Russell, when he protested war, he was in prison.
Mm-hmm.
Rabindranath Tagore is vilified to this day in Bangladesh by many who don't understand his immense contribution when the British tried to divide Bengal by their divisive policy. Moments ago when I said is that 15-year-old girl was shot by a soldier. I often teach my students that the bullet that was shot is rooted in the British history,
Sure.
is that one of the most complex border
Yeah.
between Bangladesh. And one of the things that I want our audience to recognize, and also I would like you to reflect on it, Professor Smith, is that um, Bangladesh is one of the worst victims of climate injustice, and right now in number one
Yeah.
location when where we're trying to flee the country, when we try to cross the Mediterranean from Libya to Italy. Italy's foreign minister, sorry, state
Hmm.
minister, sends navy military
Yeah.
to,
Yeah.
hungry, weak people
Yeah.
drowning.
Yeah.
That's the treatment, right?
Yeah. That's right.
Now, my question to you is that if this is the situation, that intellectuals have been persecuted, and now scholars in my areas of research say that we are going through a reality vertigo. We can't know anymore what is true from what is false because of the amount of information we're exposed to, which is why Theodore Adorno was very scared of Walt Disney. He treated him the most dangerous man.
Yeah.
How would we, how would we help young minds to recognize that during these difficult times, general people can become extraordinarily cruel. That during the Nazi persecution of the Jews, it were the neighbors. The neighbors turned to each other. What
Yeah.
happened in Hutu and Rwanda,
Yeah.
in Hutu and Tutsi genocide,
Yeah.
that the neighbors took machetes, and which is happening in many parts of the world. I mean,
Yeah.
Bangladesh is not an exception. Could
Yeah.
you speak to that? That how everyday people
Yeah.
can turn cruel?
Yeah. Well, um, so let's notice something that if people commit atrocities, that means people
Mhm.
are capable of committing atrocities. So then we have to ask, under what circumstances does that occur? And the temptation is to think of those who do commit atrocities as monsters. But that's precisely the wrong way to look at it because it's a way of distancing oneself. Uh, the fact is, there's something about the way the human mind works and our responsiveness to certain forms of political forces that are capable of getting many of us, I would guess most of us, to do these awful things. Um, so that if that's the case, as it certainly is, um, then we need to think about how we can protect ourselves from falling victim. And that's you and me too,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah. And people think of again, I'm Jewish, I can say this. Hitler is a monster. No, he wasn't a monster. He was a human being. And all of them were. Hus, who ran Auschwitz, was a human being. He loved his children and appreciated art and music and so on. Um, so, so what safeguards do we have? Well, there isn't a vaccine. There's something we have to work on, and we have to work on all the time. Um, the world doesn't, to sort of misquote Martin Luther King, the arc of history does not bend towards justice unless we bend it. We have to keep pushing because there are always people who want to divide us, to exploit us, to turn us against one another. So the proper study of history is very, very important. And I mean the history of one's own nation or one's own group. Because if we, whoever we are, have got blood in our hands and all nations are born in violence in one way or another, if we accept that, then we have to accept that it's possible for us. And we did it. And maybe we'll do it again. Maybe we're doing it now. It raises questions. Americans are really bad at that because we've never been forced to confront the worst aspects of our history. That's why I described some of them in graphic detail in my
To
books.
this day, to this day.
To this day, yeah, and we're nowhere near it. It would puncture too many illusions we have. We've never been brought to our knees. I mean, the Germans were brought to their knees. Germany was destroyed. They pretty much had to, and it's still not a total success by any means. Right, so that's one bit. Another bit is self-knowledge. It really is important to understand the vulnerabilities of human psychology that make us receptive to these political forces, this sort of propaganda, which make it possible for us to think that in perpetrating atrocities, we're doing the right thing. One of the things I tell my students is people who commit genocide always think they're saving the world from evil. It's a highly moralistic procedure. The Holocaust, the Nazis saw themselves as getting rid of these Jews who were responsible for everything wrong in the world. So the sense of moral conviction can be really, really dangerous.
And stubborn blindness.
Yeah, that's right. So that's another self-knowledge, knowledge of history, and then supporting, of course, institutions which protect us or can protect us, but unfortunately they can all be subverted by those in power who want to divide us. You know, free speech is great, but the Nazis in their early days were always complaining about their free speech being interfered with. They produced posters of Hitler, being silenced with a piece of tape over his mouth and so on. I think one of the things that's really important is people having basic security. So if the appeal of these vendors of salvation goes along with a sense of helplessness, and what they do in their propaganda, by the way, is they try to get people to feel helpless and vulnerable. Right? Our great history, we've abandoned our destiny, and we've let the nation or the race or the religion down or whatever. It starts like that, and then it goes to, yeah, but it's not really us. It's the Jews, it's the Muslims, it's the refugees coming from Africa and so on. They're the real threat. And then what you get sold, this magical solution. Oh, I'm the only, let's make us great again. I'm the only one who can save us, you see. So they generate this sense of fear and helplessness. I think it's really a mistake to describe all these things in terms of hate. Hate is like one little component. I think fear, dread, these are much more important emotionally motivating factors. So it really helps if there aren't already terrible insecurities there for these people to play on. It really helps, I think, if people have enough to eat, that they have work where they're not exploited, where they don't live in fear of being assaulted, robbed, kicked into the dirt, right? So those basic social conditions, I think, are very important. But all of these, like I said, there's no vaccine. There's no vaccine. So we have to just keep at it. And it's an ongoing project.
Yeah. I want to invite you in advance when your book Monster comes out, Monster Making, to have a book review I'm looking forward to that book, absolutely, I before I forget, and I wanted to invite you for give us another time to actually review that book to see the content. Yeah.
Sure. Anytime. I'll join you anytime you like.
Thank you so much. You have now. I'm going to go. I want to go on a difficult subject. You have invited your readers to read the most painful, difficult history of our nation.
Mm-hmm.
And you have adequately argued that how people in power and privileges, how they beautify history, and the whole education as a project, which I mean, there are many scholars, but I know who have also attested to your point, like Louis Althusser, ideology, as state
Hmm.
apparatus to, indoctrinate us.
Yeah.
So basically, education is working to indoctrinate, to make us consumer, to make us essentially citizen, not a critical thinker.
Mhm.
Now, let's talk about one groups of people who have been brutally marginalized, persecuted. Now, the same group have become one of the cruel um, occupiers. I'm talking about the messianic Jewish settlers in West Bank. Is
Yeah.
that how? I mean, one might think that if you go through a lot of pain and suffering, you will learn to be compassionate and kind towards others. But the
Doesn't work that
same group,
way.
could you speak to that? And how do you feel being a Jewish
Yeah.
person yourself? And when you see that that kind of atrocity that is happening against Palestinians,
Yeah.
the occupation,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
the murdering of the innocent people, how do you relate to that? What do you say to a lot of Muslims that feel heartbroken from different parts of the world, saying that, did you not go through this? How could you do that to ourselves?
People are always doing that because most groups of people have at one time or another been victimized, and they've also been victimizers. So it's not mysterious, and there's nothing especially saintly about Jewish people. By no means. If situations had been reversed, let's say Germany was a Jewish state and there was an Aryan minority in a long historical uh, precedent of demonizing them, yeah, Jews would have done the same thing. That we're human, and being human makes us capable of horrendous acts. Uh, but of course, like with everything, like what you said about the division of Bengal,
Mhm.
we can look to the British Empire again for an historical understanding of the mess and the horror in Israel and Palestine, right? It was part of the empire.
Mhm.
The Brits promised promised it to both groups. They had no business promising it to anyone,
Mhm.
right? So there are these deep historical precedents, and their self-interest. Um, and look, I think the proper attitude is let's fix this. Let's fix this as decent human beings, and with full recognition of all of the forces that are hostile to fixing things, because it's in the interest of a lot of people not not to fix things. Um, is that likely to succeed? I doubt it, but you still got to try to do what's the right thing. As I like to say, borrowing from Brother Cornel West,
Mhm.
I'm hopeful but not optimistic. So you tell the truth. You tell the truth about the racism and the brutality. Um, and that should predominant. I'm a very big advocate of people hanging out their own dirty laundry. So when I'm speaking to Jewish people, it's the Israeli side, and when I'm speaking to Americans generally because of the American support for Israel. I would like Arabs and Muslims to do the same with their atrocities. But of course, Israel has the power here, right? That's another reason why, with power comes responsibility. So, yeah, awful pattern of history.
Um, you one of the in the last chapter of the book in humanity, I wanted to draw so much on also less than human.
Mm.
Um, you invite the reader to imagine that there are two aspects of understanding dehumanization and resisting dehumanization. One is political,
Yeah,
other one is psychological.
yeah,
I don't know if you have actively drawn on Buddhist philosophy.
No, I haven't. I'm a little bit familiar with it.
Yeah. So I have found a remarkable, um, in a similarity in the way you are looking at the world, and Buddhist philosophy looks at the
It's
world.
really interesting.
Yeah. So if you think about the night when Buddha was enlightened under the Bodhi tree,
Hmm.
and he witnesses the daughters of Mara, the evil,
Yeah.
right? He's present and he understands that Mara is the same and the undivided.
Hmm.
Each of us, our
Yes.
our evil side is not separate from us.
No, and I think, in fact, the very notion of good and evil is
Mhm.
playing into that dualistic.
Yeah,
The
yeah,
world isn't like that. I
yeah.
mean, good and evil are moral judgments. They're not
Mhm.
descriptions of how things are actually arranged.
But there was the tricky part, and I want you to comment on that. That the three Abrahamic faith,
Yeah.
Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, it looks at the world in a binary: saint versus the
Hmm.
Satan, God versus
Yeah.
ungodly,
Yeah.
and all of that binary.
Yeah.
So, and I want you to also think about Marx here. Is that when Marx argued that you need to produce and reproduce that dialectical social relation to create the hierarchy to
Hmm.
generate the profit. But when Buddhist philosophy is saying, no, you that is part of you. It doesn't
Hmm.
separate,
Yeah.
right? Do you feel concerned? I feel concerned, is that the idea of morality or belief or religious dogmatism, that creates the kind of binary in our head that normalizes extraordinary cruelty towards others, and we feel okay by that?
Oh, yeah. So depends what you mean by morality there, but let's go to religious dogmatism. I think religion is an incredibly powerful force. It Freud said the belief in God is a product of our deepest and most urgent wishes, right? So there's something, and maybe I should expand on that a little bit.
Please.
So Freud wrote this really wonderful little book that has influenced me profoundly, actually, for studying authoritarian politics. It's called The Future of an Illusion.
And your dissertation was on Freud's psychology.
That's right,
Yeah.
yes. I was a psychoanalytic therapist in my previous career as well.
Mhm.
So Freud is interested in the psychology of religion, and here he means the Abrahamic religions.
Mhm.
And he says, look, human beings are able to reflect, and all of us understands in our heart of hearts that we're vulnerable, we're helpless. We're helpless against the forces of nature. We're all going to die. And, the natural pandemics and floods and famines and so on. And we're helpless against the cruelties inflicted by our fellow human beings. And so there's this longing for safety, this longing for protection, this desperate longing for safety. And that sort of throws us back on the positions we were in when we were infants, when we were utterly dependent on others. And basically, he sees religion as a product of that attitude. We're looking to the parent, the parent in the sky, as it were. I think it's a deeply compassionate view of the religious impulse, and it's actually quite similar to Marx's also deeply compassionate view. The spirit of an unspiritual situation, hard and heartless world. So that gives religion immense power, and it can be immense power for good. I'm an atheist, but I'm not one of these people who says religion is all evil. It's not. But it's also anything with immense power for one thing has immense power for something else. So religion, oh God, it's like an explosive. It needs to be handled very carefully, and it can do great damage if you're careless with it. And because of that, religion has always been a tool for people who want to divide us and want us to harm our fellow human beings.
Mhm. I think you're probably familiar with this author, Eckhart Tolle.
Yeah, I know of him, but don't
Okay,
know him.
okay.
Yeah.
So Tolle, in one of the arguments, he problematizes, gives a very important insight about religion, is that pretty much all religion promises of a utopian future,
Hmm.
given that you partake in
Yeah.
extraordinary cruelty now,
Mm.
purge the world from this particular group or that
Yeah.
particular group,
Yeah.
and then we're gonna, and then the Buddhist philosophers will come and say that no, there's no such thing.
Yeah.
Uh, so, I mean, in a very insightful interview, Noam Chomsky was once asked his religious view, and he responded, and I found it very valuable and also
Mhm.
compassionate. He said that, look, I'm not going to give a mother who has lost a child to a terrible situation, who is
Mhm.
finding some kind of solace
Yeah.
in some ritual. I'm not going to go and give that person an epistemic lecture that, whether there's any truth to it.
Mm.
But at the same time, he's not blind to religion's capacity of
Yeah.
mobilizing immense people. So he
Yeah.
himself is not religious, he's an
Yeah.
atheist. But then his ways of looking at those who believe in religion, I felt very compassionate and touched that.
Yeah. Yeah. So I agree with him. I mean, being alive is really hard
Yeah,
if we're honest, and we all need something to get us through the night. And just because my drug, is scholarship, say, and someone else's drug is Islam, hey, we both need something to get us through the night. So my view is people should smoke whatever they want as long as they don't hurt other people. All right? That's where I draw the line. We all need our illusions. It,
yeah, yeah,
it's and that's really hard to face, right?
yeah,
That we
yeah,
need our illusions
yeah,
because, well, for reasons that Freud laid out in that book that I mentioned.
yeah, yeah. Um, Yuval Noah Harari, he's, I really admire his ability to say things in deceptive simplicity but so profound.
Mm.
He argued in one of the books, like *Sapiens*, that human beings live in two realities simultaneously. One is probably, and if we don't go into philosophy, because philosophers are still arguing if there's such a thing called reality.
Yeah, yeah.
You are a philosopher, so
Well, I don't do that kind of stuff. Believe me, I think that's a waste of time. That
yeah.
argument is.
Yeah, so I remember, I don't forgot the name of that philosopher, Stanford. He had a very, the documentary "I'm Not Your Negro."
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Yeah,
James Baldwin, not a philosopher, novelist, but well, I would consider him a philosopher actually, but
no, no,
philosopher.
no. There was a Stanford philosopher that he was in conversation with.
Oh, okay. I don't know.
Somebody, a white, a philosopher from Stanford University.
Oh, okay.
And when James Baldwin was saying that, that philosopher came out and said, "Well, I hear Baldwin, but each of us, we have our different realities." And he's going into this philosophical realm. And then Baldwin says that, I don't know, when you teach curriculum, I don't see that you respect, my culture, my heritage. When you make the education board, you don't hire me. When you
Yeah.
build housing, black people are not in there. I
Hmm.
don't know whether you love me or not. In your action, it proves otherwise.
Yeah.
Obviously, he was a writer, he was a poet, he was a philosopher. Obviously,
Yeah.
his insights were impeccable. But I was thinking that was such a beautiful way to put it.
Mm.
So, in situation like this, Harari brings that human beings live in two realities at the same time. One is fictional,
Yeah.
that you are an American, I am not an American.
Yeah.
You are Jewish, I am Muslim.
Yeah.
So that's the one reality.
Hmm.
And then there's objective reality, that there's water, there is tree, there is,
Yeah.
yeah, that objective reality that makes us survive. And Harari says that our fictional reality is of such importance that we are not hesitant to destroy the only planet, the
Mm.
only planet.
Yeah.
So, what would be some of the ways, in your view, something that we constantly can exercise from whatever our social locations from is that not to dehumanize those who are dehumanizing others, because by dehumanizing them, we also compromise our own humanity.
Yeah.
This is something that that's a concluding chapter. Tell us some of the recommendations that you come up with from the book in Inhumanity to
Mhm.
resist dehumanization.
Yeah, well, I've mentioned some of them already, so let me just focus on what I haven't mentioned. A
Mhm.
couple of things.
Yeah.
One is the proper attitude to the evil ones, as we like to think of them, is to look at the mirror that they hold up to us, right? There, but for the grace of God, go I, right? This is not some strange alien deviant creature. This is a human being whose developmental pathway has taken them in that direction. Um, and in a weird way, I guess I know I'm recommending identifying with them as a human being, as a suffering human being, not to minimize the awful things that they've done, um, but to identify with them as human. I'm a humanist. Um, Another and very important one, which I've alluded to earlier, right at near the beginning of this conversation, it's a fantastic conversation, by the way, thank you for involving me, is this horrible idea of race. And I really mean it. I think it's one of the most evil, if we're going to use that kind of moral language, and I will here, destructive, toxic ideas. It has nothing in its favor, everything against it. But we seem to be addicted to it. We cling to it. We cling to even those who are, campaigning for social justice, find themselves clinging to this idea, affirming it, affirming it, affirming it. Even those who have been victimized by it, even those who have been racialized by people wishing to oppress them, have adopted the very categories that the colonialists have imposed on them. If we could do something about that, if we could resist collectively, I think it would stand a very good chance of making a vast improvement in our prospects. Unfortunately, identities are so bound up in these notions of race that, again, I don't see it happening. Or if it does happen, it'll be too late. Climate change, catastrophic climate change will be upon us. The population of Bangladesh will be trying to spill into India and all end up on the barbed wire.
Yeah, yeah, and then I often say that when Bangladeshis, for their life, when they try to cross the border, first they get bullet, not a compassionate
Yeah.
consideration that what causes them that. I will take a question from an anthropologist that how can we make sense, Dr. Shongita Roy? How do we make sense of the theoretical philosophical location of authors in their text vis-a-vis their actions, particularly when they have been involved in various forms of sexual violence against women? How do we cite such an author without unease around their action?
That's a question I don't know how to answer. So there are a lot of people who have been significant to intellectual traditions, rightly or wrongly, who have either committed awful acts or who have endorsed them. Heidegger is an example. You mentioned Heidegger. Well, I find Heidegger completely incomprehensible. So, and actually, when I first came across his work, I thought this just stinks of fascism, right? Just there's something about the whole thing. But yeah, no, I don't know how to address that. It seems wrong if a person makes if the person's intellectual role, has been to be influential in one way or another, to ignore that. That I think is obviously incorrect. But it is also wrong to minimize or to leave unsaid their dark side. And beyond those hand waving generalities, I don't think I have anything intelligent to say about that.
I use and I want you to comment on that. Is that, I mean, I use Marxist interpretation in many of the things that I do, but when I talk about Marx, or when I talk about John Stuart Mill,
Mm-hmm.
or when I talk about scientific racism or Immanuel Kant,
Yeah.
and this is what I have contested with professors all my life, is that teach all you want Immanuel Kant,
Yeah.
but recognize
Yeah.
that he too has done this. So the easy expression that not throwing the baby with the bathwater.
Yeah. But I think really there's another step that needs to be
Mhm,
taken there.
mhm.
Because some people will do that, but somehow insulate Kant's racism from his philosophy. And I don't think we should do that either. There's got to be some relationship there. I mean, racist ideology is racist ideology, like ideology is pervasive. Marx, too, all these people. Now, that doesn't mean that we're saying all their work is rubbish because they're racist or misogynists or abusers or whatever. But I think it's very important for the history of ideas to examine, to not attempt to purify
Yeah, yeah.
things that are impure.
I think there's a risk. Me being a graduate of social justice and equity studies, I think there is a risk of danger that, in our pursuit of doing good, somehow we can subscribe into an illusion that we are not capable of doing the damage to others. And this is where I quote Dostoevsky, is that one of the most stubborn form of lies that we lie to ourselves, because at one point we cannot distinguish between the truth and the lies we keep telling to ourselves.
Mm.
And if I give you a hypothetical question, now let's say Hitler, it wasn't Newton, it was Hitler who gave the theory of gravity. This is
Mm-hmm.
how gravity works.
Yeah.
I would use Hitler's idea that,
Sure.
he
Yeah.
explained this phenomena,
Of
but
course.
he also has done this tremendously cruel, brutal
That's right.
thing.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
right.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like for example, I'm not a fan of Trump, but when Trump went to North Korea, there are one or two things he has done good.
Yeah. There are one or two things he's done good. That's
Yeah.
absolutely right. And I would agree. I agree with you on that. See, part of this sort of the righteous dismissal of severely imperfect people is often accompanied by an idealization of ourselves. My wife, who's also a philosopher, she says, I start sinning from the moment I wake up. She's not religious. She's an atheist like me. But what she means is, I'm complicit in the system. I buy cheap clothes from Walmart that are, made with people on slave wages in Southeast Asia. Uh, we are all part of the system, like it or not. It's a structure that envelops us. So we are not pure. We are complicit in injustice. Um, so let's be careful. Let's be careful about our
Yeah, yeah,
attitudes towards
yeah.
others.
And that's why where, and which is actually, this is what I've learned from Buddhist philosophy. And one of the very and it's very hard to categorize him, whether he's a historian or a philosopher or a
Mhm.
psychologist. um, Jiddu Krishnamurti, he has lived a very long time in he one of the ideas, I mean, I remember, and I often tell this story, that when I started reading a book, I went into depression, but then I emerged out of it,
Mhm.
understanding our own conditions, that understanding the human conditions, in the words of Nietzsche, human all to human.
Mhm.
When I first read Krishnamurti, and I'm not kidding you, literally, I went into a I was in California on a visit. I threw the book across, like the ideas were, it was so hard. It was so hard. It took me about 10 years to come
Mhm.
to terms with that. That at that time I was in my 20s. I was an idealist, and I did not know my unconscious narcissism about my own perception of
Yeah.
pure self
Yeah.
who is out there to do good.
Yeah.
To say the least, I don't know. I mean, sometimes I ask myself, looking at this predicament, is that our human conditions, whether to laugh at it or cry?
Both. Both.
I don't know. I genuinely feel that way, Dr. David. I don't know how to
Look,
do.
there's a Yiddish expression, laughing with the ashikas. It literally translates as laughing with the worms. And it means, it refers to that sort of laughter which has tragedy behind it, right? You're laughing with the ashikas.
Dr. Smith, thank you very much. And I love you for saying that. Is that laughter has always been my coping mechanism.
Mm,
And my laughter has been misunderstood by many.
mm,
And I say that I'm not laughing at you, I am laughing with you
mm.
at the stupidity of our actions, our absurdity of human conditions, that things
Yeah, yeah. I mean, sometimes all you could do is laugh or cry or scream, that there aren't words to express this awareness of one's position in the scheme of things.
Yeah, yeah. Um, Professor Smith, I would request you, and as I have said, that we'll be using this conversation for facilitating many
Mhm,
conversations and dialogues among Bangladeshi students, mostly very marginal students who don't have
mhm,
access to scholars like you.
mhm.
Um, we use these conversations to see dialogue among them. I would request you, from time to time to come and join us.
Hey, look, anytime you invite me, I'm here. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. David. It was an absolute pleasure talking to you
Likewise.
and a spirit
Likewise.
uplifting experience.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor David. And all of us, who have been with us, thank you very much for being
Thank
with
you,
us.
everyone, for
And
this.
please, 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 when your book comes out, the monster making, we would want to organize a conversation reviewing the book.
Right. That sounds great. So you need to send me your email address so I can pass it on to my
Yeah.
publicist.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day, Dr.
Okay.
Smith.
Bye
Bye.
bye. You too.
Bye.